Hi, I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. And you may have noticed that we are doing a video version of the podcast now. I'm very excited to come to you every week with a video, and let me know in the comments what you'd like to see in the future. In honor of Women's History Month, we'll tell the stories of some fierce ladies. Sometimes a woman's strength is her salvation. Sometimes it's her curse. Some rise from the ashes, others drag the world into the flames with them. They haunt, they hunt, they protect, and they destroy. Some wield their power for justice, others for vengeance, and some simply because they can. In the light, they are heroes. In the dark, they are nightmares. So which one are you? First, death doesn't always stay buried, followed by fear is an invitation. Finally, in our last story, you can try, but you can't outrun her. Before we get to our stories, I wanted to ask if you would take a minute to send this podcast to someone who you know loves horror. There are hundreds of podcasts out there, and the biggest influence on what people listen to is what their friends recommend. You can also rate and comment on our podcast on both Spotify and YouTube. So let us know what you think. I read all of your comments, and I try to respond to most of them. Thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful for all of our listeners around the world. So, want to hear something scary? Daughters of Darkness. Sometimes the dead don't rest. They linger in the spaces waiting for the living to listen, like in this true crime ghost story. It began with a dream. At first, Mary J. Hester thought little of it. The night had always been restless since Zona's death, grief's weight pressing on her chest, keeping her awake. But this dream was different. There was something about the way Zona appeared in it, her face pale, her neck twisted in a way that shouldn't have been possible, her eyes wide, locked onto Mary Jane's, filled with an unspoken warning. The morning after the dream, Mary Jane found herself standing in the small parlor of her home, her fingers trembling as she poured a cup of coffee. She had thought it was just the sorrow that had twisted her thoughts. But as the day passed, the memory of the dream clung to her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. And then there were the whispers, quiet murmurs she could barely hear, something just beyond her grasp. She could swear they came from the corner of the room where Zona had once sat. She dismissed it, or tried to. But that night, as she lay in bed, the house felt wrong. It was too still, too silent, like the air itself had thickened. The wind outside rattled the window panes, but it wasn't the storm that made her skin crawl. It was the sensation that something had changed, something unseen, but always present. And then, in the corner of her room, there was a shadow. A shift in the darkness, something moving where there shouldn't be movement. At first, it was nothing more than a trick of the light, her tired eyes playing tricks on her. But then, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, pale and thin, her neck bent at an unnatural angle. She stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. Her voice, when it came, was soft, barely a whisper. "Mama, he did it." Mary Jane's heart stuttered in her chest. The words were clear, unmistakable. Zona's voice, but so hollow. The figure lifted her trembling hand to her neck, where dark bruises had settled into the skin. "He did it in anger. He crushed my throat." The figure's head jerked violently to the side, the sickening sound of bone snapping ringing in the air. Mary Jane couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure drifted closer, her eyes hollow pools of nothingness, staring through Mary Jane as if she could see into the deepest parts of her soul. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the weight of the ghost's presence. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, but the words remained. The next morning, the decision was made. Sheriff Knapp listened patiently, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "You're saying your daughter's ghost spoke to you?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with doubt. Mary Jane nodded, her voice unwavering. "I know what I saw. I know how she died." The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flicking to the window as if something outside might be watching. "And you're sure it wasn't grief playing tricks on you? The mind can do strange things in mourning." But Mary Jane's conviction didn't waver. "Exhume her. You'll see the truth." It had been weeks since Zona's death, ruled by natural passing by the doctors, but Mary Jane had never believed it. She had been there, seen the way Zona's neck had been wrapped so tightly with scarves and high collars, how Erasmus had been so insistent on keeping her covered. There was no explanation for it, no reason for the sudden, unexplained death, but there was one, a simple one. Erasmus had killed her. The sheriff sighed, exchanging a glance with his deputy, a silent conversation passing between them. But in the end, he agreed to her request. "We'll open the grave," he said, though there was a wariness in his voice, as if he expected something worse than the simple truth. When the grave was opened, the air felt heavier than before, thick with something unspoken. The moment the coffin was pried open, the crowd fell silent. Mary Jane stood at the edge, watching as the authorities uncovered the body of her daughter. Zona's face was pale, still untouched by the rot that should have set in. But it was the neck that caught everyone's attention. There, in the delicate skin, were bruises. Finger marks, deep and unmistakable, wrapping around her throat like a cruel reminder. And when the body was examined more closely, the truth became undeniable. Zona had been strangled, the neck broken clean through. Erasmus had murdered her, and now the world would know. The trial was swift. Erasmus' Shue denied everything, of course. He claimed it was an accident, a sudden loss of control, but the evidence told a different story. There were whispers about the ghost, about the strange occurrences that had led up to the discovery. Some dismissed it, but others couldn't shake the feeling that something had pushed Mary Jane to uncover the truth, something beyond the natural world. Mary Jane never spoke of the ghost again, but she didn't need to. The truth was in the court's verdict. Guilty. Erasmus Shue was sentenced to life, though his life wouldn't last long. Within a year, he was found dead in his cell, an unfortunate casualty of prison life, or so the authorities claimed. But there were others who whispered that Zona's wrath had followed him, that the spirit of the girl he'd killed had found its way to him in the end. Mary Jane lived out her days quietly, but she would often sit at the window in the still of the night, staring into the darkness. Some nights, when the wind howled just right, she could almost hear the whisper of Zona's voice, just beyond the reach of hearing, watching, waiting. And in the silence of the night, the weight of the past never quite left. When something unexplainable happens to you, like a dream with dead people in them, do you ignore it or look for deeper meaning? Hi all, have you checked out our Patreon? I'm going live over there in just a few weeks, so sign up now and you won't miss an update. Fear is a door, and once you open it, some things step through. Like this story inspired by Aisha. When I was 10, I went to Africa for the summer. My parents promised we'd be back soon, but I was furious about having to cancel plans with my friends, instead having to spend time with family I'd never met. As soon as we arrived, I felt out of place. Everything was foreign. The people who picked us up were distant relatives, seriously looking, silent, keeping to themselves. It was our first time meeting them, yet they barely acknowledged me or my siblings. They simply waved, helped my parents with the luggage, and muttered among themselves in hushed tones. I stayed on my phone most of the ride to the house, but I couldn't ignore the unease crawling under my skin. The house was old, inherited from my late grandfather, and sat deep in the more rural part of the city. The moment we arrived, my father showed us to our rooms. We ate, changed, and were ready for bed when he turned to me. "Check the back door," he said. "Make sure it's locked, and the front gates too." I didn't want to go alone, so I grabbed my siblings, Together, we hurried to secure everything. When we returned, my father locked the front door himself and moved through the house, pulling every curtain shut. And that became routine. Every night, doors locked, curtains drawn, until the night that everything changed. That day, I had fallen asleep in the afternoon. I was sharing a room with my little sister, so I told her to go play and let me nap. When I woke up, the room was pitch black. It took me a second to remember where I was. Then hunger hit. I climbed out of bed, groggy, but determined to find something to eat. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. Something was soft, but deliberate. My bed's headboard was near the window, and the noise could only be coming from the glass. Slowly, I turned my head. A face, pressed against the window. Charred skin stretched tight. Eyes too bright, too wide. Hair combed out in wild directions. A smile impossibly wide. Teeth glinting in the moonlight. My stomach lurched. A crumpled peanut wrapper stuck to the glass beside its cheek, held in place by the moisture of its breath. Tap, tap, tap. It was tapping with a single finger, tilting its head as if waiting for me to react. I stumbled up, nearly tripping over my own feet. My heart pounded as I ran for the door, reaching for the handle, and stopped. The body stood in the doorway, small frame, dark skin, almost glowing in the night. A red dress, shimmering yet torn, the fabric catching the light like it always was in motion. No head, one arm. Tap, tap, tap. I turned back to the window. The face was still there, still grinning. Then the head vanished. A rush of air, like something moving too fast to see. And suddenly, the body in the doorway had a head. Its grin stretched impossibly wide as it lunged. Cold fingers clamped over my mouth. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. My back arched, my body bending unnaturally as the grip tightened. I squeezed my eyes shut and prayed to God, prayed for anything that could make it stop. Then a door slammed open, footsteps, fast, heavy. Hania! The grip loosened. I gasped for air, stumbling forward in the light, spilling from the hallway. My father stood in the doorway, his face a mix of shock and something else. Understanding. He turned toward the window. The moonlight was enough to see it. For a second, his face tensed, just enough for me to notice. Then he looked at me. "Go to bed," he said, voice quiet but firm. "I'll explain in the morning." That night, I slept with my parents. The next morning, my father called me over. "Tell me everything you saw," he said. So I did, every detail. He listened carefully, then nodded. "Don't be afraid," he said. "That was the Yani, a witch." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "They eat human flesh," he continued. "But more than that, they feed on fear. They take many forms. They can possess people, curse them, through hair, nail clippings, footprints in wet earth, even through your voice." I swallowed hard. "The doors and windows must always be locked at night," he said, "so they cannot enter. And the curtains must always be closed, so they cannot choose their next victim." I shivered. Then my mother spoke, telling me to follow her. She led me to the courtyard, where my grandmother sat on a woven mat, her hands resting on a string of prayer beads. "She saw the Yane," my mother told her. My grandmother nodded, unsurprised. "She was chosen." "Chosen?" She gestured for me to sit. "You are growing, Hanaya. The Yane seeks girls like you, on the edge of childhood and womanhood. That is when they try to take you." My breath caught as she told me I was strong, which is why it did not take me that night. It tested me. I said nothing. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what would have happened if I had failed. That afternoon, my mother and grandmother performed ruqya, a cleansing prayer. They burned harmal leaves, letting the smoke curl around me, and tied a protective charm to my wrists. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The curtain was closed tight, but I could still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I wouldn't give it my fear. The tapping stopped. The next morning, I told my grandmother. She smiled and handed me the prayer beads. "Keep them close," she said. "You are safe now." And I was, but I never forgot. I never forgot the way it watched me, or the way, for a moment, I almost felt it pulling me into the dark.
Have you ever let any witches or spirits in? If so, tell us your story by sending us an email at SomethingScary@Snarled.com. Sometimes a river can go silent, and sometimes it whispers. If it whispers your name, you may never come back, like in this story inspired by this Indian urban legend, the White Swan.
The sun was setting over the small village of Mahadavpur, nestled by the sacred Kaveri River in southern India. For the villagers, the river was both a lifeline and a place of worship. Its waters fed crops, cleansed bodies, and nourished souls. But there was a fear creeping through town. Whispers were still in the air that she was coming back, the White Swan. Ravi had grown up hearing the stories. The goddess Swamiji was said to protect the land and rivers, punishing those who dared harm and disrespect nature. His grandmother had spoken of her. She could take the form of a swan, her feathers as white as snow, her eyes glowing with the fire of divine fury. But it wasn't until the recent deaths of 2 fishermen and the destruction of a nearby forest that the rumors felt more than just superstitious. "You shouldn't swim in the river after sunset," the elders warned. "Not even to bathe. She's watching." But Ravi was still young and skeptical, dismissed it. He had left the village years ago, his life now in the city. He'd returned only to visit his aging parents. The myths of his youth felt distant, irrelevant. Life in the city seemed far removed from such silly things. His mother had warned him too, but he had laughed it off. That evening, he sat by the river, watching the sky turn from purple to black. His thoughts drifted to his childhood, when he and his friends had swum in the waters without a second thought. But now, it felt different. Its waters darker, tainted, polluted. "Ravi, come inside," his mother called from the house. "It's getting late." But Ravi, lost in his thoughts, ignored her. This place still held some strange comfort, the cool river breeze on his face. And that's when he saw it. At first, it was just a flash of white among the reeds. Then it appeared, a swan, larger than any he had ever seen, gliding effortlessly across the water. Its plumage was impossibly white, gleaming in the fading light. But it was more than that. Its eyes were glowing, burning with an eerie light. Ravi's heart skipped a beat. He heard the legends, but to see it, her, in person, was something else entirely. Before he could even move, the swan dipped its head beneath the water. Moments later, it resurfaced, but this time, it wasn't alone. Something else followed it, something darker, more menacing. The water, which had once been clear, had become murky, swirling with an unnatural force. Ravi took a step back, unsure of what to do. His rational mind told him it was just a swan, just nature. But deep inside, a cold dread gripped him, something he couldn't explain, a primal fear that told him to leave. The swan let out a low, mournful cry, and for a moment, Ravi thought he heard voices from beneath the surface, soft, echoing whispers, as if the water itself was speaking to him. He froze. From the depths of the river, a figure began to rise, slowly, impossibly, moving like liquid. A woman, her skin pale as moonlight, her eyes glowing with an unsettling light. She wore a white sari, the fabric clinging to her body like it was part of the river itself, her long hair flowing like the current. Ravi's breath caught in his chest. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a long moment, he couldn't move. There was something ancient in her eyes, something that made the world feel still, as if everything around him had paused to listen. She stepped toward him, barely disturbing the water's surface, and spoke. Her voice was soft, yet carried a weight to it, like the wind before a storm. "You pollute the land," she said, her words sharp, as if every syllable was a decree. "You disrespect the river. Do you think you can escape the consequences?" Ravi's mind raced. He had never believed any of this. Swamiji, the white swan, it was just all stories. But standing there, with the weight of her words settling around him, something shifted. The air grew heavier, suffocating. I don't understand, Ravi stammered, his voice barely a whisper. She tilted her head, as though considering him. Then she motioned toward the river. You see what your kind has done. The waters, once sacred, now run black. The creatures of the forest are gone. What remains is a shadow of what once was. Ravi opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Her eyes seemed to pierce through him, reading every thought, every secret he had buried deep inside. You've ignored the warnings, she continued. You think your life in the city, your distance from this place absolves you, but you can't escape the river's judgment. A cold wind swept across the water, and the woman's figure began to dissolve, melting into mist. The swan disappeared too, vanishing beneath the surface. The river, for a moment, was still. Too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the water began to churn, violently, as though it had had a life of its own. The current surged, pulling at Ravi's legs, dragging him closer to the water's edge. He staggered back, his heart pounding. Before he could react, the ground beneath him gave way. He slipped, falling into the river with a splash. The water was stronger than he remembered. The current swept him away, pulling him deeper into its depths. He fought to stay afloat, but the water was relentless, and he struggled. His feet brushed, something cold and slimy, something floating in the water, a bloated, rotting fish. He gagged, pushing it away, but the current didn't relent. It carried him farther, pulling him toward the center of the river, toward the very spot where the swan had appeared. And then he saw her again, the woman, Swamiji. She was standing in the water, her white sari glowing like a beacon in the dark. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Ravi understood. This wasn't just a punishment for the river's pollution or the destruction of the land. It was something deeper, a reckoning for his indifference, for turning away from the sacred land, from the things that mattered. The swan reappeared beside her, its wings massive, its eyes glowing like molten fire. Ravi's breath caught in his chest. He understood now. The river wasn't just protected by Swamiji. It was the river. Anyone who disrespected the land, the water, or its creatures would face her wrath. The woman's voice echoed through his mind. You cannot escape your own destruction. And then the water closed over him. The next morning, the villagers found Ravi's body on the shore. His eyes were wide open, filled with terror, as though he had seen something that shattered him completely. His clothes were soaked through, his skin a strange pallid hue. The villagers whispered that the white swan had claimed another soul. No one spoke of the woman who had risen from the river that night, but they all knew and had been reminded that the river was sacred, that it would not tolerate disrespect. The white swan would always return.
Have you ever been called by the river? If the river takes revenge on only those who disrespect it, how many of us would be safe?
This week's podcast stories were edited by Sarah Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Anna Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sindalo and Calvin Linderman. If you have a story you'd like to submit, send me an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. Don't forget to watch the video version of Something Scary over at youtube.com/snarled. And if you'd like to support the show and everything we do at Snarled, join our Patreon at patreon.com/snarled.
As always, witches, thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this week's stories, and I really hope you enjoyed the video version of the podcast. As always, sweet screams, and I'll see you next week.